Dr. Malachi Rhodes, a successful black surgeon, arrives in a small town to investigate its failing hospital, only to face blatant racism and corruption. Officer Huxley, a racist cop, targets Malachi, accusing him of stirring trouble and arresting him without cause. As Malachi uncovers shocking evidence of embezzlement and abuse of power involving the hospital's leadership, he faces relentless intimidation and prejudice. This gripping tale explores the infuriating realities of racism in America, the abuse of authority, and one man's courageous fight against a deeply entrenched system of greed and discrimination. The town of Ridgewood was still waking up as the morning sun painted the brick facades of its small downtown in hues of amber and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from the local bakery and the distant hum of cars starting their daily commutes. Nestled amidst the unassuming storefronts was Maggie's Diner, a modest establishment with checkered floors and faded red booths. It was the kind of place where locals gathered for coffee refills and easy conversation, a space where everyone seemed to know everyone, except perhaps the man who had just stepped inside. Dr. Malachi Rhodes entered the diner quietly, his tall, commanding figure softened by his casual attire. A charcoal sweater hung loosely over dark jeans, and a pair of well-worn leather loafers completed the look. He carried an air of quiet authority, though nothing about his demeanor demanded attention. He greeted the hostess with a polite nod before choosing a booth near the window, where the morning sunlight streamed in, illuminating the lines of quiet thought etched into his face. Despite his unassuming presence, Dr. Rhodes was far from ordinary. A renowned cardiothoracic surgeon and the CEO of Rhodes Health Innovations, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing healthcare access to underserved communities, Malachi was a man who could easily command the attention of boardrooms and conference halls. But here, in Ridgewood, he was just another face, a stranger in a town that seemed to pride itself on knowing its own. This anonymity suited him. It was part of why he chose to spend time in places like this, where titles and accolades held no weight, and the rhythm of life moved a little slower. As he unfolded the diner's menu, a waitress approached, her smile polite, but guarded. She was young, likely in her early 20s, with auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail and an air of practiced efficiency. Her name tag read, Lisa. "Morning," she said, her tone neutral. "Coffee to start?" "Yes, please," Malachi replied, his voice warm but reserved. He glanced up, meeting her eyes briefly. "Black. No sugar." Lisa nodded and scribbled on her notepad, her expression barely shifting. To her, he was likely just another out-of-towner passing through. A safe assumption in a place like Ridgewood. Still, Malachi could sense the faint undercurrent of something more in her demeanor, a hesitance born of wariness. He had seen it before, in countless interactions across his career. The subtle way people adjusted themselves around him, as if recalibrating their expectations. Here, in this small diner, it was no different. As he waited for his coffee, Malachi let his gaze wander across the room. The diner was modest but cozy, with vintage posters adorning the walls, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. At the counter, two older men sipped their coffees, their conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh. A young couple sat in a booth near the door, sharing a plate of pancakes. It was a snapshot of small-town life, unassuming and unhurried. But there was something about Ridgewood that felt different. Beneath the veneer of quaint charm was an undercurrent of tension, subtle but palpable. Malachi had sensed it the moment he arrived the day before. It was in the way eyes lingered on him a beat too long as he walked down the street, in the polite but clipped tones of the hotel clerk who checked him in, and now in the cautious smile of the waitress pouring his coffee. "Anything else for you?" Lisa asked, setting the steaming mug on the table. Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes flickered briefly to the bracelet on his wrist, a sleek, minimalist band with the Rhodes Health logo engraved on it. Her curiosity was fleeting, but Malachi noticed. "Just the coffee for now," he replied, offering a small smile. Lisa nodded and moved on to the next table, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Ridgewood was not unfamiliar territory for Malachi, though he had never been to the town before. His work often took him to places like this, tight-knit communities grappling with challenges that were both systemic and deeply personal. Ridgewood, like many towns of its size, had a hospital that was underfunded and understaffed, its resources stretched thin, and its patients left waiting for care that often came too late. It was why Malachi was here, to assess the situation firsthand and determine how his organization could help. But even as he prepared to extend a hand, he knew it wouldn't be easy. Change was rarely welcomed in towns like this, where tradition often held more sway than progress. And then there was the matter of who he was. A black man, wealthy and accomplished, stepping into a community that had likely seen few people like him in positions of authority. It was a reality he had long since accepted, but never grown accustomed to. The way his identity seemed to challenge unspoken expectations wherever he went. The door to the diner jingled as a man entered, his boots heavy against the linoleum floor. Malachi glanced up and saw a figure who seemed to embody Ridgewood's unyielding character. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans and a sheriff's badge gleaming on his belt. His name, Malachi would later learn, was Officer Grant Huxley, though the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere made his role clear before any introductions were necessary. Huxley's gaze swept the diner, pausing briefly on Malachi before moving on. It was a look that lingered just long enough to register, a silent acknowledgement that Malachi didn't quite fit the landscape. The officer approached the counter, greeting the men seated there with a gruff familiarity before ordering his coffee. Malachi turned his attention back to his own cup, willing himself to focus on the work ahead. But the weight of Huxley's presence lingered, an unspoken tension that seemed to ripple through the room. It wasn't overt, no words exchanged, no accusations made. But it was there, an undercurrent of scrutiny that Malachi had learned to recognize all too well. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, noting a message from his assistant back in New York. Preliminary reports from Ridgewood General attached, call when you can. He made a mental note to review the files later, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Excuse me," came a voice, pulling Malachi's attention. He looked up to see one of the older men from the counter standing beside his booth. The man, dressed in a plaid shirt and suspenders, offered a polite but guarded smile. "You new in town?" the man asked, his tone friendly enough, though his eyes held a flicker of curiosity that bordered on suspicion. "Just visiting," Malachi replied evenly, setting his coffee cup down. "I'm here to look into some opportunities for my organization." The man nodded slowly, his smile tightening. "What kind of organization?" Malachi hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Healthcare. We work to improve access in underserved areas." The man's brow furrowed slightly, his curiosity deepening. "That's so. Well, Ridgewood's been getting along just fine for years. Don't know if we need outsiders coming in and stirring things up." The comment was casual, almost offhand, but it carried a weight that settled heavily between them. Malachi met the man's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "Sometimes getting along isn't enough," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves more than just getting by." The man studied him for a moment longer, before offering a curt nod and returning to his seat. Malachi exhaled slowly, his grip on the coffee cup tightening. It was a familiar dance, this careful navigation of spaces that weren't quite ready to welcome him. As the diner settled back into its rhythm, Malachi turned his gaze to the window, watching the sunlight play across the street outside. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that his presence here would likely be met with resistance. But he also knew why he was here, and that was enough to steady him. The subtle tensions in the diner were just the beginning. He could feel the conflict brewing, like the first rumble of a distant storm. And as he sat there, preparing himself for what lay ahead, Malachi Rhodes resolved to face it head-on, with the same quiet strength that had carried him through every battle before. Dr. Malachi Rhodes hadn't planned to spend more than a couple of days in Ridgewood, but as the morning unfolded, he began to sense that his stay might stretch longer than expected. He finished his coffee and left a tip on the table before heading out into the crisp autumn air. The town's main street was beginning to hum with activity, shopkeepers propping open their doors, and a few pedestrians wandering between stores. Malachi's destination was Ridgewood General Hospital, a facility he had heard described in concerning terms during his preliminary research. Understaffed, underfunded, and struggling to meet the needs of the community. As he walked, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his assistant, Carla. "Good morning, Dr. Rhodes," Carla said, her voice brisk. I forwarded the hospital's financial reports and a summary of recent community feedback. It's bleak. Malachi paused near a small bookstore, scanning the street as he listened. That's what I expected, thanks, Carla. I'll review it all tonight. One more thing, Carla added, her tone hesitant. I saw the email you forwarded about the hospital's director. Are you sure about meeting with him? His record doesn't exactly scream progressive. Malachi smiled wryly. I'll manage, thanks for the heads up. As he ended the call, Malachi noticed a patrol car idling a few yards down the street. Officer Huxley sat inside, his gaze fixed on Malachi with a pointed intensity that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the first time Malachi had been watched like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He adjusted his scarf, letting his expression remain calm, and continued toward the hospital. Ridgewood General was a modest building, its brick facade weathered and its sign faded. Inside, the air was tinged with the antiseptic scent of a place trying its best to maintain sterility. Despite limited resources, Malachi stepped into the lobby, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite but wary smile. I'm here to see Dr. Morris, Malachi said, his tone professional. The receptionist hesitated, her eyes scanning him briefly, before flicking to her computer screen. Do you have an appointment? I do, Malachi replied, pulling up the confirmation email on his phone and showing it to her. The woman's brows furrowed as she scrutinized the screen, as if double-checking for some hidden discrepancy. Right, she said finally. Dr. Morris's office is down the hall, second door on the left. Thank you, Malachi said, pocketing his phone. As he turned to leave, he caught the way her gaze lingered on him, an expression that hovered somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. He knocked on the office door and heard a gruff, "Come in." Dr. Stephen Morris sat behind a cluttered desk, his graying hair combed back and his glasses perched low on his nose. He barely looked up as Malachi entered. You must be Rhodes, Morris said, his tone brusque. Take a seat. Malachi did as instructed, noting the faint air of irritation in Morris's demeanor. It wasn't hostility exactly, but there was an edge to it, as though Malachi's presence was an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. I understand you're here to evaluate the hospital, Morris began, folding his hands on the desk. I'll be honest with you, we don't have time for vanity projects. We need real solutions, not grand gestures from outsiders. Malachi smiled tightly, accustomed to this type of skepticism. I assure you, Dr. Morris, I'm not here for a photo op. My organization specializes in addressing systemic issues in healthcare delivery. I'd like to learn more about your challenges so we can determine how to help. Morris leaned back, studying him with a faint smirk. And what makes you think you can fix problems we've been dealing with for years? Experience, Malachi replied simply. He pulled a folder from his bag and slid it across the desk. Here's an outline of similar projects we've implemented in other communities. I think you'll find the results speak for themselves. Morris flipped through the folder, his expression neutral. Impressive, he admitted grudgingly. But Ridgewood isn't like other places. The people here, they're set in their ways. Change doesn't come easy. That's true everywhere, Malachi said. But that's no reason not to try. Before Morris could respond, the office door swung open, and a nurse poked her head in. Dr. Morris, we've got a situation in the ER. They need you. Morris stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath. He glanced at Malachi. We'll continue this later. In the meantime, feel free to look around. As Morris left, Malachi exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The meeting had gone about as he expected. Polite on the surface but laced with resistance, he knew winning Morris over would be an uphill battle. The hospital tour only deepened Malachi's concerns. Equipment was outdated, staff were overworked, and patient rooms were crowded. In the pediatric ward, he overheard a nurse apologizing to a frustrated mother about a delayed procedure due to a lack of available specialists. It was a familiar story, one Malachi had heard countless times in underfunded facilities across the country. As he made his way back to the lobby, Malachi noticed Officer Huxley standing near the entrance, speaking with a security guard. Their conversation stopped abruptly as Malachi approached, and both men turned to watch him. Dr. Rhodes, Huxley said, his tone flat. We need to talk. Malachi raised an eyebrow. Is there a problem, officer? Huxley's gaze narrowed. You've been asking a lot of questions around town. People are starting to wonder what you're really doing here. I'm here on business, Malachi said evenly, and I believe I've been transparent about my purpose. Maybe, Huxley said, stepping closer. But we don't take kindly to outsiders stirring things up. Some folks think you're overstepping. Malachi felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not here to cause trouble, officer. My only goal is to help this community. Huxley smirked, the expression cold. Help, huh? Well, just remember, you're a guest here. Don't overstay your welcome. The implicit threat hung in the air as Huxley walked away, leaving Malachi standing alone. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with men like Huxley before. Men who wielded their authority like a weapon, eager to remind him of the limits they thought he should have. But this was different. This was personal. Later that afternoon, Malachi returned to the diner, hoping for a quiet place to gather his thoughts. But as soon as he stepped inside, he sensed something had shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence, and eyes turned toward him, their expressions guarded or openly hostile. Lisa, the waitress from earlier, approached hesitantly. Dr. Rhodes, she said softly, glancing around. You should know. People have been talking about you. Malachi's brow furrowed. Talking about what? Lisa hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Officer Huxley's been telling folks you're here to cause trouble. He said you're trying to make the town look bad. Malachi felt his stomach sink. That's not true. I know, Lisa said quickly. But people trust Huxley. And around here, it doesn't take much for a rumor to stick. Malachi nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had expected resistance, but this was something else entirely. Huxley wasn't just watching him, he was actively working to undermine him, leveraging his position to stoke fear and mistrust. Thank you for telling me, Malachi said, offering Lisa a small but sincere smile. She nodded, her expression a mixture of sympathy and worry. As Malachi sat down, he felt the weight of the room's collective gaze pressing down on him. He had come to Ridgewood to help, but now it was clear that his very presence was being weaponized against him. The road ahead was growing steeper, and for the first time, he wondered if his efforts might be doomed before they truly began. Dr. Malachi Rhodes sat in his hotel room, staring at the stack of documents spread across the desk. The financial reports from Ridgewood General painted a bleak picture: underfunding, staffing shortages, and a sharp decline in patient outcomes over the past 5 years. Yet, none of it was surprising. What gnawed at him was the growing sense that he wasn't just dealing with negligence, but something more insidious. He glanced at his phone. Carla had sent another message. Local papers picked up chatter about you. Huxley's stirring the pot. Be careful. Careful. The word felt hollow. Malachi wasn't a man who operated on caution. He thrived on strategy, precision, and purpose. But Ridgewood was testing him in ways he hadn't expected. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Malachi tensed. Visitors weren't common during these trips, especially not unannounced. When he opened the door, he found Lisa, the waitress from Maggie's diner, standing there. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. I didn't know where else to go, she said, her voice trembling. I think something's happening. Something you need to know about. Malachi gestured for her to sit, his calm demeanor masking his growing concern. Take your time, he said, his voice steady. Lisa hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her nerve. I overheard Officer Huxley talking to someone at the diner. He said they're going to make an example of you, something about a meeting tomorrow at the hospital. He said you're poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Malachi's jaw tightened. Did he say what they're planning? She shook her head. No, but he sounded angry, like he wanted to shut you down. Malachi exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Huxley's hostility had been palpable from the start, but this felt different. Calculated, Ridgewood wasn't just resisting change, it was defending something worth hiding. Thank you for telling me, Malachi said, his tone measured. It couldn't have been easy to come here. Lisa looked down, wringing her hands. People here, they don't like outsiders, but what they're doing isn't right. You don't deserve this. Her words carried a weight Malachi couldn't ignore. He nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll handle it. You've done enough. Lisa stood to leave, but paused at the door. Be careful, Dr. Rhodes. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. The following morning, Malachi arrived at Ridgewood General prepared for a confrontation. He wore his usual calm-like armor, his every step measured as he made his way through the hospital's corridors. The meeting with Dr. Morris was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but the air of tension told him something was already amiss. When he entered the boardroom, it was clear this wasn't a routine meeting. Huxley stood near the window, arms crossed, his presence a silent warning. Dr. Morris was seated at the head of the table, flanked by two other men Malachi didn't recognize, both older, with the polished but detached air of seasoned bureaucrats. Dr. Rhodes, Morris said, his tone clipped. Thank you for joining us. Take a seat. Malachi sat, scanning the room. I wasn't aware this was a group discussion. It's become one, Morris replied curtly. There are concerns we need to address. Huxley stepped forward, his smirk barely concealed. Dr. Rhodes, we've been hearing some interesting things about your activities here in Ridgewood. Folks say you've been asking a lot of questions, stirring up trouble. I've been gathering information to better understand the challenges this hospital faces, Malachi said evenly. If that's troubling, perhaps you should examine why. Huxley's smirk faltered, but Morris cut in before he could respond. This hospital operates within a delicate balance, Dr. Rhodes. We can't afford distractions or disruptions. Distractions? Malachi repeated, his voice sharp. You're running a facility that's failing its community. I'm here to help fix that. One of the men beside Morris leaned forward. Help, or meddle. We've seen outsiders like you before, swooping in with big ideas and no understanding of how things work. Malachi held his gaze, his composure unwavering. What I understand is that people are dying because this hospital doesn't have the resources it needs. If that's meddling, then so be it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy. But Huxley wasn't finished. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Malachi. We've done some digging of our own, he said. Seems like you've got a history of pushing boundaries. Lawsuits, investigations. Some folks might call that a pattern. Malachi opened the folder, skimming the contents. It was a collection of half-truths and misrepresentations, stitched together to cast doubt on his integrity. He felt a flicker of anger, but tamped it down. You're reaching, officer, he said, closing the folder. Desperation doesn't look good on you. Huxley's smirk returned. We'll see how desperate you feel when the town hears about this. Morris leaned forward, his expression hard. Dr. Rhodes, you've clearly overstepped. I suggest you end your involvement here before things get worse. Malachi stood, his chair scraping against the floor. You're not protecting this hospital. You're protecting yourselves, but I promise you, the truth will come out. As he left the room, he felt the stares of the men behind him, their silence louder than any words. Later that afternoon, as Malachi walked to his car, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the hospital's entrance. At the center was Huxley, his voice loud and commanding. Doesn't belong here, he was saying. We don't need someone from the outside coming in and telling us how to run our town. Malachi approached, his presence drawing the attention of the crowd. Huxley turned to face him, his smirk widening. Dr. Rhodes, he said mockingly, care to explain yourself? Malachi met his gaze, his voice steady. I'm here to help. That hasn't changed. Huxley stepped closer, his tone cold. Help or disrupt? Because all I see is someone who doesn't know his place. The crowd murmured, their faces a mix of confusion and hostility. Malachi felt the weight of their eyes, but he refused to back down. My place, he said, his voice rising, is standing with the people who need change. If that makes you uncomfortable, officer, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The tension crackled in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Huxley stepped even closer, his voice a low growl. You're done here. Before Malachi could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. That's enough. It was Lisa. She stood at the edge of the group, her expression fierce. Dr. Rhodes is here because our hospital is falling apart, and you all know it. Let him do his job. The crowd shifted, uncertainty rippling through them. Huxley's smirk faltered, but his anger didn't. Watch yourself, Lisa, he snapped. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, she shot back. And so do you. Malachi felt a surge of gratitude, but kept his focus on Huxley. "The truth has a way of coming out, officer. I suggest you prepare for it." With that, he turned and walked away, the murmurs of the crowd following him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. The sun dipped low over Ridgewood, casting long shadows across the town square as Dr. Malachi Rhodes approached Maggie's diner. He knew stepping back into this space was a risk. Rumors had already spread like wildfire, thanks to Officer Huxley's relentless campaign. Still, Malachi had no intention of shrinking from the fight. He wasn't just here to defend his reputation. He was here to uncover the truth. As he opened the door to the diner, the familiar jingle of the bell seemed louder in the tense quiet. Conversations hushed, eyes turned toward him, and the atmosphere crackled with barely concealed hostility. Malachi met their stares with calm resolve, his presence a silent challenge to the whispers and accusations that had followed him all day. Lisa was behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee into a mug. When she saw him, her face paled, but she gave a quick nod of acknowledgement. Malachi returned it, making his way to an empty booth in the corner. He could feel the weight of the room's attention, but he refused to let it show. He had faced worse than this before, and he wasn't about to falter now. 20 minutes later, Malachi's focus was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching his booth. He looked up to see Officer Huxley standing over him, flanked by another officer, a younger man with a hesitant expression. The din of conversation ceased entirely, leaving an eerie silence in the diner. "Dr. Rhodes," Huxley said, his tone mocking. "Fancy seeing you here again." Malachi placed his mug down deliberately, meeting Huxley's gaze. "Officer Huxley, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Huxley's smirk deepened, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "We need to have a little chat. Why don't you step outside with us?" "Is there a problem?" Malachi asked evenly, though his instincts told him this was anything but routine. Huxley leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Malachi to hear. "Let's just say there's been a complaint. Suspicious activity. Wouldn't want things to get messy in front of all these nice folks." Malachi's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He stood, adjusting his coat with measured precision. "Lead the way." Outside, the air was cooler, the streets bathed in the fading light of dusk. Huxley stopped near his patrol car, turning to face Malachi with an expression that bordered on triumph. The younger officer hung back, shifting uncomfortably. "Dr. Rhodes," Huxley began, his voice dripping with false civility. "You've been causing quite a stir, asking too many questions, poking around where you don't belong. People are nervous." Malachi raised an eyebrow. "Nervous or upset that someone's finally exposing the cracks in their system?" Huxley's smile faded, replaced by a scowl. "You think you're clever, don't you? Coming into our town, acting like you know what's best." "This isn't about me," Malachi said firmly. "It's about a hospital that's failing its community. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine your role in the problem." The younger officer cleared his throat, as if to interrupt the escalating tension, but Huxley silenced him with a glare. Turning back to Malachi, he stepped closer, invading his space. "You're making a mistake, Rhodes, one that's going to cost you." Before Malachi could respond, Huxley's hand shot out, gripping his arm. The move was sudden, aggressive, and clearly calculated to humiliate. Malachi froze, his instinct screaming to pull away, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Is this necessary?" he asked, his voice steady. Huxley smirked. "Just making sure you don't run off before we're done here." Malachi locked eyes with him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "I have no intention of running, officer. Can you say the same?" For a brief moment, Huxley's smirk faltered, replaced by something darker. He released Malachi's arm with a forceful shove and stepped back. "You're done here," he growled. "Stay out of Ridgewood's business, or you'll regret it." As the patrol car pulled away, Malachi stood alone on the sidewalk, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Huxley's personal vendetta. There was something deeper at play, a system that seemed determined to protect itself at all costs. But Malachi wasn't going to back down. He knew he needed to act, and quickly. He pulled out his phone and dialed Carla. When she answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Carla, I need you to dig deeper, he said, his voice low. Look into Huxley Morris, anyone connected to Ridgewood General financial records, incident reports, anything that doesn't add up. Understood, Carla replied. And you? I'm going to confront Morris directly, Malachi said. This ends now. The next morning, Malachi arrived at Ridgewood General earlier than usual. The hospital was quieter than normal, the staff moving with a nervous energy that suggested they knew something was brewing. As Malachi made his way to Morris's office, he noticed the younger officer from the previous night standing near the entrance. Their eyes met briefly, and the officer looked away, his discomfort palpable. When Malachi entered the office, Morris was seated at his desk, his expression guarded. He didn't look surprised to see Malachi. Dr. Rhodes, Morris said, his tone cool. What can I do for you? Malachi closed the door behind him, stepping forward with measured calm. We need to talk off the record. Morris leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. About what? About what's really happening here, Malachi said, his voice firm. The underfunding, the mismanagement, the resistance to outside help. It's not just negligence, is it? Morris's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. I've seen enough to know that this isn't just a struggling hospital, Malachi continued. There's a deliberate effort to keep things the way they are, and you're part of it. Morris's eyes flashed with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Malachi pressed. I've been doing this long enough to recognize the signs. The question is, how far are you willing to go to protect whatever you're hiding? For a moment, Morris said nothing. Then he stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. You don't understand this town, Rhodes. You don't understand what it takes to keep it running. Then enlighten me, Malachi said, his tone unyielding. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're sacrificing the community for your own interests. Morris's face hardened, but before he could respond, the office door burst open. Huxley strode in, his expression livid. That's enough, he barked. Rhodes, you're under arrest. Malachi turned to face him, his calm demeanor unwavering. On what charges? Huxley smirked. Obstruction trespassing. Take your pick. Morris looked away, his silence damning. Malachi knew then that he was alone in this moment, but he wasn't defeated. As Huxley stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, Malachi straightened his shoulders. You can try to silence me, officer, he said, his voice steady. But the truth has a way of coming out. Huxley's smirk widened. We'll see about that. Malachi Rhodes sat in the dimly lit holding cell, his mind racing despite the calm he projected. The events of the past hour played over in his head. Huxley's smug expression as he slapped the cuffs on, the brief but charged exchange with Morris, and the stares of the hospital staff as he was marched out like a criminal. Ridgewood wasn't just resisting him. It was fighting to protect something ugly, something that Huxley and his allies were willing to defend at any cost. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Malachi straightened as Huxley appeared, his keys jingling. The officer leaned against the bars, his smirk as infuriating as ever. Enjoying your stay? Huxley asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Not quite the hospitality I was expecting, Malachi replied evenly, refusing to let the officer see his frustration. Huxley chuckled, unlocking the cell door but leaving it closed. You're bold, I'll give you that, but you've overstayed your welcome. Ridgewood doesn't need you. Malachi leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, but laced with steel. What Ridgewood doesn't need is someone like you, someone who abuses their power to protect corruption. Huxley's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. Big words for a man in a cage. I've seen enough to know what's happening here, Malachi continued, his gaze unwavering. The hospital isn't failing because of lack of resources, it's failing because people like you are skimming from the top. Huxley's expression darkened, his smug demeanor giving way to anger. He stepped closer to the bars, his voice a low growl. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Malachi pressed. Money meant for equipment, staff salaries, community programs. It's all disappearing, and I doubt you're the only one benefiting. Huxley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence between them crackled with tension. You think arresting me will make this go away? Malachi asked. You're only proving how desperate you are to keep this quiet. Huxley barked a short laugh, You think anyone's going to believe you? You're an outsider, a meddler. People around here know who to trust, and it's not you. Malachi leaned back, his calm unshaken. We'll see. Hours later, as the town hall clock struck midnight, Malachi found himself in a conference room at the police station. To his surprise, Detective Mitchell Hayes, a weary but seemingly principled officer, had intervened, pulling him from the cell and demanding an immediate explanation from Huxley now. The three men sat across from each other, the tension thick enough to cut. "This is highly irregular," Huxley muttered, glaring at Hayes. "What's irregular?" Hayes shot back. "Is arresting a man without clear charges. Now, let's hear it. What exactly is he accused of?" Huxley shifted uncomfortably. "Obstruction, trespassing." "Neither of which justify an arrest," Malachi interjected, his tone calm but firm. "I was detained because Officer Huxley sees me as a threat, not to the law, but to his secrets." Huxley slammed his hand on the table, his face flushing red. "You watch your mouth." "That's enough," Hayes said sharply. He turned to Malachi. "Dr. Rhodes, do you have evidence to support your claims?" Malachi hesitated briefly, then reached into his jacket pocket, producing a USB drive. He had obtained it earlier from Carla, who had managed to pull preliminary financial records from the hospital's public filings. He slid it across the table to Hayes. "These are financial discrepancies I uncovered," Malachi explained. "Large sums of money unaccounted for in the hospital's budget. I suspect kickbacks and embezzlement, but I need more time to prove it." Hayes inserted the drive into his laptop, his brow furrowing as he scrolled through the files. This is serious," he said finally, his voice low. "If this checks out, it's more than enough to launch an investigation." Huxley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is nonsense, fabricated data from a man trying to cover his own." "Sit down, Huxley," Hayes snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. Huxley hesitated but complied, his fists clenched at his sides. His veneer of control was cracking, and Malachi could see it. "This is bigger than you, officer," Malachi said, his voice measured. "Bigger than whatever you're protecting." Huxley glared at him, his breathing heavy. "You think you're a hero? You don't know anything about this town, about what we've had to do to survive." "Survive?" Malachi repeated, leaning forward. "Or profit. Because from where I'm standing, you're not protecting anyone but yourself." The words hit their mark. Huxley's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, Malachi thought he might lash out. But Hayes intervened, standing and placing himself between the two men. "This ends now," Hayes said, his tone brooking no argument. "Dr. Rhodes, I'll take this evidence to the DA as for you. Huxley, consider yourself on administrative leave pending further investigation." "You can't do that," Huxley snarled. "You don't have the authority?" "I do," Hayes interrupted, his voice like steel. "And if you want to keep your badge, I suggest you cooperate." The confrontation had ended, but Malachi knew the battle was far from over. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a mixture of relief and resolve. He had made progress, but exposing the corruption in Ridgewood would require more than just evidence. It would require the community's support. The next morning, Malachi stood in front of Ridgewood General, surrounded by reporters and townspeople. The financial documents had been leaked to the press, sparking outrage and disbelief. With cameras trained on him, Malachi spoke with quiet authority. "This is about more than numbers on a spreadsheet," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's about a community that deserves better. Ridgewood General should be a place of healing, not a tool for greed. Together, we can fix this, but it starts with accountability." As he stepped back, Lisa approached, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. Malachi nodded, his expression softening. "This isn't over yet, but we're on the right path." In the crowd, he spotted Hayes watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Malachi knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The conference room at Ridgewood's town hall was packed, a low hum of whispers rising and falling as Dr. Malachi Rhodes stood at the front, his shoulders squared. The space was oppressive, not from the heat, but from the tension, a simmering stew of anger, suspicion, and distrust. Seated near the center was Officer Huxley, his expression a blend of disdain and feigned indifference. Next to him sat Dr. Stephen Morris, the hospital director, whose face betrayed thinly veiled panic. Both men had everything to lose, and Malachi was determined to make them answer for it. "This meeting is a courtesy," Malachi began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "A chance for transparency, for accountability. But let me be clear. If that doesn't happen today, I will ensure the truth comes out another way." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Huxley leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "Big talk for an outsider," he called out, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "But you don't know this town. You don't know us." "I know enough," Malachi replied, fixing him with a piercing gaze. "I know that while Ridgewood General struggles to keep the lights on, someone's been siphoning off funds meant for patient care, and I know that you, Officer Huxley, have been working to cover it up." A collective gasp rippled through the room, and Huxley bolted upright, his chair scraping against the floor. "Watch your mouth," he snarled, his composure slipping. "You can't prove a damn thing." Malachi remained unfazed. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, holding it up for all to see. "These are the financial records I've uncovered, payments routed through shell companies, invoices for equipment that never arrived, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and guess whose names appear over and over? Yours, Officer Huxley, and yours, Dr. Morris." All eyes turned to Morris, who looked as if he might slide under the table. "This is outrageous," Morris sputtered, his voice trembling. "You don't have the authority." "What I have," Malachi cut him off, "is evidence. And if you'd like, I can share it with the district attorney right now." The room erupted in whispers, the air crackling with tension. Huxley's face darkened, his fists clenched at his sides. He took a step toward Malachi, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're untouchable? You think you can waltz into my town and destroy everything we've built?" "What you've built is a monument to greed," Malachi shot back. "While patients suffer, while doctors burn out, you've been lining your pockets." The two men stood toe-to-toe now, the space between them charged with unspoken threats. Malachi could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. He had fought too hard, come too far, to falter now. From the back of the room, Detective Mitchell Hayes stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Dr. Rhodes," he said, his voice steady. "May I see those documents?" Malachi handed him the folder without hesitation. Hayes flipped through the pages, his expression growing graver with each line. Finally, he looked up, addressing the room. "This isn't just mismanagement," Hayes announced, his tone firm. "This is criminal embezzlement, fraud, potentially even racketeering, and if this evidence holds up, arrests will follow." The room descended into chaos. Shouts of disbelief and outrage filled the air as Huxley turned on Hayes, his face contorted with fury. "You're taking his side. You're a traitor to this town." "I'm doing my job," Hayes replied coldly. "Something you forgot how to do a long time ago." Malachi felt a flicker of relief, but knew the fight wasn't over. He turned to address the crowd, raising his voice to be heard over the din. "This isn't about me. It's about Ridgewood, about the people who depend on that hospital. They deserve better than this." His words seemed to strike a chord. The crowd began to quiet, their anger shifting away from him and toward the men who had betrayed their trust. Morris shrank further into his seat, while Huxley looked ready to explode. Suddenly, Huxley lunged, grabbing Malachi by the collar and shoving him against the wall. Gasps filled the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Malachi stared into Huxley's eyes, seeing the desperation and hatred boiling just beneath the surface. "You think you're a hero?" Huxley growled, his voice a low hiss. "You're nothing. You don't belong here." Malachi's chest tightened, not from fear, but from rage. He had spent a lifetime enduring men like Huxley, men who used their power to oppress and intimidate. But this time, he refused to be a victim. "I belong wherever there's injustice," Malachi said, his voice unwavering. "And no amount of bullying will change that." Huxley's grip tightened, but before he could go further, Hayes and another officer pulled him back, forcing him to release Malachi. "That's enough," Hayes barked, his voice ringing with authority. As Huxley struggled against their hold, Malachi straightened his coat, his calm composure unbroken. He turned to the crowd once more, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is what happens when corruption goes unchecked," he said, gesturing toward Huxley. "It breeds violence, arrogance, and fear. But it doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can rebuild this community. But first, we have to clean house." The room erupted in applause, the sound drowning out Huxley's incoherent shouts as he was dragged away. Morris sat frozen, his face pale, as Hayes approached him. "Dr. Morris," Hayes said, his voice cold, "you're coming with me." As the room emptied, Lisa approached Malachi, her eyes wide with admiration and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Malachi nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm fine. This is just the beginning." "You were incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." Malachi's smile widened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's not the first time I've had to fight a battle like this, and it won't be the last." Lisa reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've given this town hope, don't forget that." As she walked away, Malachi allowed himself a moment to breathe. The confrontation had been intense, but it was a necessary step toward justice. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. The days following the explosive confrontation in Ridgewood were a whirlwind of activity. Officer Huxley and Dr. Morris had been taken into custody for questioning, and news of the scandal had spread like wildfire. Local media camped outside Ridgewood General, their cameras capturing every update as the small town grappled with the fallout. For the first time in years, the people of Ridgewood seemed to be waking up to the corruption that had plagued their community. Malachi Rhodes sat in the office of Detective Mitchell Hayes, watching as the detective sifted through the growing stack of evidence. The files Malachi had uncovered, combined with testimony from whistleblowers emboldened by his actions, painted a damning picture of a network of greed and exploitation. "This is bigger than I thought," Hayes admitted, his voice low. "Huxley wasn't working alone. Morris funneled money to several players in town, developers, council members, even a few higher-ups in the county." Malachi leaned back, his exhaustion evident, but his resolve unshaken. "What happens now?" Hayes looked up, his gaze steady. "We move forward, arrests, prosecutions, and a lot of cleaning house. It's going to take time, but the evidence you brought to light gives us a fighting chance." The words brought a flicker of relief to Malachi's expression. He had faced resistance at every turn, but now, finally, there was a path toward accountability. Later that evening, Malachi found himself back at Maggie's diner, sitting in the same booth where his ordeal in Ridgewood had begun. Lisa brought him a cup of coffee, her smile warmer than it had been days earlier. "You've changed things here," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "People are talking about what's possible now, about how we deserve better." Malachi nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's the goal. But the fight isn't over. It never is." Lisa tilted her head, studying him. "What about you after all this? Are you still going to keep fighting?" Malachi's gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of the town square glowed softly in the night. "I don't have a choice. This isn't just about Ridgewood, it's about every place like it. Places where people are told to accept less because they think they can't do better. I've seen too much to walk away." There was a weight in his voice, but also a quiet strength. The events of the past week had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but they had also reaffirmed his purpose. He wasn't just a surgeon or a CEO, he was an advocate, a fighter for justice in spaces that desperately needed it. Over the following weeks, Ridgewood began to change. The hospital's board of directors, under immense public pressure, announced sweeping reforms. Dr. Morris was formally removed from his position, and a temporary leadership team was installed to stabilize operations. Funds that had been diverted were tracked down and recovered, with plans to reinvest them in the hospital's infrastructure and staff. A community oversight committee was formed, allowing residents to have a voice in the hospital's operations for the first time. It was a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust. Malachi, though no longer in Ridgewood, stayed involved from a distance. He worked with advocacy groups to ensure the town received the resources it needed, and he remained in contact with Hayes, who continued to lead the investigation into the corruption network. 1 month after the confrontation, Malachi returned to Ridgewood for a community forum hosted at the newly renovated town hall. The event was packed, with townspeople eager to discuss the future and the changes underway. Malachi took the stage to a standing ovation, though he raised a hand to quiet the applause. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice steady. "This is about you, the people of Ridgewood. You stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. That's what makes real change possible." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "There's still work to do. Corruption doesn't disappear overnight, and rebuilding trust takes time. But what happened here proves that no system is too broken to fix. It proves that when we come together, we can demand better, and get it." The crowd erupted in applause once more, but this time, Malachi allowed himself a small smile. For the first time since arriving in Ridgewood, he felt a sense of peace. As the forum ended and the crowd began to disperse, Malachi stepped outside, where Detective Hayes was waiting. "Back to the fight?" Hayes asked, his tone light but respectful. "Always," Malachi replied. He extended a hand, and Hayes shook it firmly. "You've got allies here now," Hayes said. "Don't forget that." "I won't," Malachi said, his voice resolute. As he walked to his car, the cool night air filled his lungs, carrying with it the promise of the work ahead. Ridgewood was just one battle in a much larger war. But it had shown him the power of persistence and the impact of a single voice speaking truth to power. Malachi slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. Justice, after all, was not a destination. It was a journey. And for Malachi Rhodes, that journey was far from over. The events in Ridgewood had marked a turning point, not just for the town, but for Dr. Malachi Rhodes himself. Standing at the crossroads of personal resilience and systemic change, he had been reminded of both the weight of injustice and the power of perseverance. His time in Ridgewood wasn't just another battle. It was a microcosm of the larger struggle he had been fighting for years. As he drove back to New York City, the miles stretching endlessly before him, Malachi reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. When he first arrived in Ridgewood, he had seen it as just another struggling community in need of intervention. But it became so much more. A reminder of how deeply ingrained corruption and prejudice could be, and how easily power could be abused if left unchecked. Malachi knew he had changed. In Ridgewood, he had faced not only systemic resistance, but also personal threats that tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yet, he hadn't wavered. Instead, he had found strength in his ability to remain composed, to think strategically, and to fight back with the tools he knew best: evidence, reason, and an unwavering belief in justice. The experience reaffirmed his purpose: to stand up for those who couldn't stand for themselves, to challenge systems that thrived on silence and complicity, and to use his voice to amplify those of the unheard. It wasn't an easy path, but it was one he was determined to walk for as long as it took. "I've learned," Malachi thought, gripping the steering wheel, "that every small victory is part of a greater war. Ridgewood isn't the end, it's just one step." His resolve to continue fighting was stronger than ever, but he also understood that fighting for justice required more than individual effort. It demanded collective action. It was a lesson Ridgewood had taught him in the most profound way. The scandal at Ridgewood General wasn't unique. Across the country, communities like Ridgewood struggled under the weight of corruption, systemic inequities, and deeply rooted prejudice. The actions of people like Officer Huxley and Dr. Morris weren't anomalies. They were symptoms of a larger problem, a system that allowed abuse of power to flourish unchecked. Malachi had seen this time and again. In underfunded hospitals where patients were treated as liabilities rather than lives to be saved. In boardrooms where profits mattered more than people. And in the quiet complicity of those who looked the other way, rather than risk their comfort. Yet, Ridgewood also showed the power of exposure and accountability. When the community came together, when people like Detective Hayes and Lisa decided enough was enough, change became possible. Malachi realized that the work wasn't just about dismantling broken systems, it was about empowering people to demand better. The events in Ridgewood were a reminder that while systemic change was slow and difficult, it wasn't impossible. It began with a spark, a single voice, a single action, that ignited something larger. Malachi's story wasn't just about him, It was a call to action for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Ridgewood showed that even in the most entrenched systems, cracks could form. Those cracks, when widened by persistence and courage, could eventually bring the whole structure down. His message to Ridgewood, and to anyone watching from afar, was clear. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen without sacrifice, but it does happen when we refuse to accept the status quo. Malachi knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more moments of doubt, but he also knew that the fight was worth it. Every small victory mattered. Every voice raised in protest mattered, and every step forward, no matter how small, brought the world closer to justice. To the people of Ridgewood, Malachi's stand was proof that silence wasn't the answer. To his colleagues and allies across the country, it was a reminder that their work mattered, and to the broader world, it was a challenge to confront the systems that allowed inequality and corruption to persist. As Malachi returned to his office in New York, he found an email waiting for him. It was from Lisa, sent late the night before. "Dr. Rhodes, I just wanted you to know that the hospital feels different now. People are hopeful, and it's because of you. Thank you for showing us that we deserve better. Keep fighting, for us, and for everyone who needs you. You've made a difference." Malachi stared at the message for a long moment, a rare smile breaking across his face. He typed a brief reply. "Thank you. The fight continues," before closing his laptop. That night, as he prepared for the next challenge, Malachi allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The fight for justice was exhausting, often thankless, but it was also necessary, and as long as there were Ridgewoods in the world, he would keep fighting. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that required resilience, courage, and an unwavering belief that a better world was possible. And for Malachi Rhodes, that journey had only just begun. The lights of the city twinkled outside his window, a reminder of both the challenges and the possibilities ahead. And as he sat in the quiet, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The story of Ridgewood was just one chapter in a much larger narrative, but it was one that would stay with him forever. Tomorrow, he would begin again. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the victory. Not for himself, but for everyone who had found hope in his fight. And that, he realized, was enough. The end.